The mahogany door to the library stood slightly ajar, and through it drifted sounds that made Richard Montgomery freeze mid-step. His Italian leather shoes pressed into the Persian rug as he tilted his head, listening. Voices, plural, were coming from inside. But that was impossible. His son David was in there alone with Maria, the housekeeper. Richard's hand trembled as he reached for the doorknob, his heart pounding with a fear he couldn't name. What he was about to discover would shatter every assumption he'd built his empire upon and teach him the one lesson his Harvard MBA never could. Richard Montgomery had everything a man could want. The sprawling estate in Connecticut, the fleet of luxury cars, the corner office on the 47th floor overlooking Manhattan. At 42, he'd built a tech empire from nothing, turning a college dorm room idea into a billion-dollar corporation. His success story had been featured in Forbes, Time, and the Wall Street Journal. Investors called him a visionary. Competitors called him ruthless. He called himself a realist. But lately, something had been gnawing at him. His 8-year-old son David had grown distant, preferring the company of Maria, their housekeeper, to anyone else in the house. The boy would rush home from his elite private school and disappear into the library for hours. At dinner, when Richard bothered to make it home in time, David would chatter excitedly about things Maria had taught him, his eyes bright with a joy Richard couldn't remember putting there himself. "It's not appropriate," Richard had told his wife Catherine one evening over their separate tablets at the dinner table. "The help shouldn't be so familiar with David. We're paying for the best tutors in the state." Catherine had barely looked up from her screen. "At least someone's paying attention to him." The words had stung more than Richard cared to admit. Now, standing outside the library, Richard heard what sounded like multiple conversations happening at once. A woman's voice, definitely Maria's, speaking in what sounded like French? Then his son's voice, younger and uncertain, repeating the words. Then silence, followed by a completely different language, melodic and flowing. Spanish? No, something else. Then another shift, the words sharper, more Germanic. Richard pushed the door open slowly. The sight before him made no sense. Maria, a woman he'd hired 3 years ago and barely spoken to beyond polite greetings, sat cross-legged on the floor beside David. Between them lay a hand-drawn map of the world, colored with crayons and markers. Flashcards were scattered around them like fallen leaves. A worn notebook filled with careful handwriting sat open on Maria's lap. "Bonjour, comment allez-vous?" Maria was saying, her voice warm and encouraging. "Bonjour, comment allez-vous?" David repeated, his pronunciation awkward but earnest. "Beautiful." "Now, in Mandarin, remember..." Richard's throat went dry. Mandarin. French. He'd heard at least 3 other languages in the hallway. "What is going on here?" His voice came out harsher than he'd intended, sharp with confusion and something else he couldn't identify. David jumped, his face flushing. Maria rose gracefully to her feet, her dark eyes meeting Richard's without flinching. She was a small woman, probably in her late 50s, with silver threading through her black hair and hands worn from years of labor. "Mr. Montgomery," she said quietly. "I apologize if we were too loud." "Too loud?" Richard stepped into the room, his mind racing. "How many languages were you just speaking?" Maria glanced at David, who'd shrunk into himself, picking at the corner of the world map. "5, sir. We were practicing French, Spanish, Mandarin, German, and Arabic." David wanted to learn how to say hello and thank you in different languages, so I thought, "You speak 5 languages?" Richard interrupted, his voice rising. "How is that possible?" "You're a housekeeper." The moment the words left his mouth, he saw David flinch. Maria's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. A deep, old sadness that Richard suddenly realized had always been there, hiding beneath her quiet efficiency. "Dad, don't," David started. "Go to your room." "David, I need to speak with Maria alone." "But Dad, she was just teaching me. She's amazing. Did you know she was a professor? She taught at a university in Syria before." "David, room, now." His son fled, tears streaming down his face. The sound of his footsteps echoed through the massive house, each one a tiny accusation. The silence that followed was suffocating. Richard stared at this woman he'd seen every day for 3 years. This woman who'd prepared his meals, cleaned his home, and apparently educated his son in ways he'd never imagined. Syria. Professor. The words tumbled through his mind, refusing to form a coherent picture. I should have asked your permission, Maria said finally, her voice steady despite the slight tremor in her hands as she gathered the flashcards. It won't happen again. Wait. Richard rubbed his face, suddenly exhausted. Just wait, explain this to me. You were a professor? Maria hesitated, then nodded. In Damascus. I taught linguistics at the university for 18 years. I speak 7 languages fluently, Mr. Montgomery. I published papers on language acquisition and taught over 3,000 students before. She trailed off, but Richard could fill in the rest. The news hadn't been just headlines to him. Syria's civil war, the refugee crisis, families torn apart and scattered across the globe. But it had all felt so distant, so removed from his climate-controlled office and his gated community. Why didn't you tell us? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. You needed a housekeeper. I needed work. In America, my credentials mean nothing without expensive recertification. My English, while good, has an accent. I am 56 years old with no American work history. She met his eyes directly. When you have lost everything, Mr. Montgomery, pride becomes a luxury you cannot afford. I am grateful for this job. It allows me to send money to my sister in Lebanon who cares for my mother. Richard felt something crack inside his chest. And David? For the first time, Maria's composed facade softened, and a genuine smile touched her lips. David is brilliant, curious, kind. He found me reading a French novel during my lunch break 6 months ago and asked me to teach him. I told him I would need his parents' permission, but he was so insistent, so hungry to learn. I thought one lesson wouldn't hurt. Then one became 2, became 10, became this. She gestured at the scattered materials, her voice growing thick with emotion. For an hour each day, I get to be a teacher again. For an hour, I am not just invisible hands that clean and cook. I am Professor Haddad again, sharing knowledge with a student who truly wants to learn. Richard sank into one of the leather chairs, his legs suddenly unsteady. How many times had he walked past Maria without really seeing her? How many conversations had he had about hiring the right people while a former professor scrubbed his toilets? He thought of his own grandfather, an Italian immigrant who'd worked in factories despite having been an engineer in Naples. He'd built a better life for his family through sacrifice and silence. His credentials abandoned at Ellis Island along with his old identity. I'm sorry, Richard said, the words feeling inadequate and enormous at once. I'm so sorry, Maria. I should have asked. Should have seen. Most people don't, Maria said simply. We become invisible when we serve. It's easier that way for everyone. Richard looked up at her. But not to David. No. Maria's smile widened. Not to David. He sees everyone. Last week, he insisted on learning Arabic specifically so he could greet Mr. Youssef at the corner store in his native language. Did you know Mr. Youssef was a cardiac surgeon in Baghdad? David knows, he asked. Shame washed over Richard in waves. When had he stopped teaching his son to be curious about people's stories? When had success made him blind to the humanity around him? I don't want you to stop, Richard said suddenly. The lessons, I mean. Please keep teaching him. But Maria, he paused, his mind working. Would you consider doing more? I mean, what if we helped you get your credentials recognized? There are programs, processes. It's expensive and time-consuming, but, Mr. Montgomery, I couldn't possibly. Please. Richard stood, feeling more certain than he had in months. Let me help. And in the meantime, teach David. Teach him languages, teach him to see people the way you do. God knows I've failed at that. His voice cracked. And maybe you could teach me too. Not languages necessarily, but how to look at someone and actually see them. Maria's eyes filled with tears. You're serious? I built a company on recognizing untapped potential and investing in it. I've just been looking in all the wrong places. Richard extended his hand. So yes, Professor Haddad, I'm serious. 6 months later, Richard stood in the doorway of what had once been a formal dining room they never used. Now it was something else entirely. A classroom filled with natural light, walls covered with maps and alphabets from a dozen languages, shelves lined with books in multiple scripts. Maria, now officially David's language tutor and cultural studies teacher, sat at a table with not just David, but 5 other children from the neighborhood. Children of housekeepers, gardeners, drivers, all learning together. Richard had helped Maria begin the recertification process. He'd also discovered that his company's skills-based hiring initiative had been overlooking countless qualified candidates simply because they didn't fit traditional profiles. The revelation had sparked a complete overhaul of their HR practices. "Dad, come here," David called out in Mandarin, then laughed and switched to English. "Sorry, still getting used to code switching." "Look what Maria, Professor Haddad, taught us." The children performed a short play they'd written together, switching between languages, telling a story about a family separated by distance, but connected by love. Richard watched his son, now 9, command the stage with confidence and compassion he'd never seen before. After the performance, as parents arrived to collect their children, parents Richard now knew by name, whose stories he'd heard, whose dreams for their children he understood, Maria approached him. "Thank you," she said simply. "For seeing me," Richard shook his head. "Thank you for teaching me how to see. I thought I was giving David every advantage. But you gave him something my money never could, the ability to recognize value in unexpected places." That night, Richard tucked David into bed, something he'd started doing every night he was home. "Dad?" David asked sleepily. "Why do you think it took you so long to realize Maria was special?" Richard considered the question carefully. "Because I stopped paying attention to people's stories. I got so focused on balance sheets and bottom lines that I forgot the most important numbers, the countless experiences and skills and dreams that make a person who they are." "That's sad." "Yes, it is. But here's the thing about making mistakes, buddy. The important part is what you do after you realize you've made them." David nodded, then smiled. "Professor Haddad says that in Arabic there's a word, sawt, that means voice, but it also means reputation and dignity. She says everyone has a sawt, but sometimes the world makes us whisper when we should sing." Richard felt his throat tighten. "She's right. She also says you're helping her find her singing voice again. Is that true?" "I hope so. But really, she's the one who helped me start listening." Long after David had fallen asleep, Richard sat in the library where it had all begun, thinking about strange voices in the darkness and the light they'd brought into his life. He'd thought he was rich before, measured in dollars and deals and power. Now he understood that wealth had nothing to do with the numbers in his bank account and everything to do with the richness of the lives around him, if only he had the wisdom to pay attention. His phone buzzed with an urgent email from his VP, a crisis that needed his immediate attention. Richard read it, typed a brief response delegating the decision, and turned off his phone. Tomorrow would be soon enough. Tonight he had something more important to do. He needed to practice his Arabic. Mr. Yusuf's daughter was getting married next month, and Richard wanted to offer his congratulations in words that carried the weight of genuine respect. Some lessons he was learning couldn't be taught in boardrooms or bought with money. The most valuable ones came from unexpected teachers in unexpected moments, from the courage to admit you'd been wrong and the humility to learn from those you'd overlooked. In the morning, David would teach him the phrase Maria had helped him perfect. Shukran lak, thank you from the heart. It seemed like the right place to start.